Our next item, to the right one here. Now we have the 2017 General Plan Amendment referral requests, and we have 3 that were left from our last meeting that seemed to go, well, I guess we went past 1 that night. So we had 3 left, and they are back tonight. And Mr. Baca, do you want to start with the first one?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Morgan, members of the City Council. As indicated, this is a continuance from the original meeting that was started on January 25th, where we've already reviewed 3 general plan amendment referral requests. We also reviewed 2 status updates, and now we'll be reviewing the last 3 referral requests that we received for this cycle. General plan amendment referral request number 4 is on the application for the Camino Ruiz LLC, which is a request to amend our general plan land use element designation of the site from its current industrial designation to high-density residential, which could accommodate up to 30 dwelling units per acre. And it's to be determined whether or not that would be for sale or rental. That has not yet been decided. And that would be proposed on 4 acres of an existing 20-acre site. We had a similar general plan amendment referral request in 2014 for this site that was denied by the City Council at that time. So the applicant has requested the consideration of a concept for working towards a high-density residential development over the northern portion of a 14-acre approximate configuration of a 20-acre site. The property would preserve 2 existing industrial office buildings in place on the remaining 6 acres, which would be on the southern portion of the property fronting Camino Ruiz and the 101 freeway. If this general plan amendment is referred for further study, the application would necessitate a zone change, most likely a residential plan development permit, typically a land division, and of course environmental analysis to comply with CEQA requirements. The aerial photograph shows that the site is at the southeast corner of Verdugo Way and Camino Ruiz. Existing land uses surrounding the property include the Tessa Robles medium-density attached townhome project, which is shown as a vacant lot in the aerial photograph. And then we have offices to the north along Verdugo Way. And south of the site is the 101 freeway. And there are existing and improved industrial properties to the east. So this site is currently improved for industrial and office uses, and it has 2 vacant industrial buildings, a vacant office building, and then 1 occupied office building. The current general plan designation is industrial, as shown on this map, and the current zoning is limited manufacturing. So the action would be to consider to allow the general plan amendment referral to move forward into an application, or deny the referral, or continue discussion if necessary. And then, of course, the council could provide direction if there are any special studies that they feel are warranted at this time. So I wanted to just ask if it was the pleasure of the mayor for me to continue to discuss the other general plan amendment referrals, or if you want to pause here and discuss this one in particular before moving on to the next.
Last time we did them one by one.
Yeah.
I'm assuming
It's easier.
Okay, so let's do this one first.
Okay.
Does that finish complete staffs?
Yes, it does.
I don't have any speaker sheets. While we're getting those, are there any questions of our staff?
A question.
Mr. Chimbley?
I do have a series of questions, if I can. So, Mr. Vaca, on the bottom of page 12 of the staff report, first question, and it's also pages 2 and 3 of 6 in the staff report. I guess I'm not quite sure. It's big 12 on our numbering system, and then 2 and 3 in the pages 2 and 3 of the
We
staff
go by
report.
the big numbers usually.
Okay, there we go. So the 2 industrial buildings would be removed, as I understand it. And those 2 buildings, if I am correct, represent about 14 acres out of the approximate 20 acres parcel size, correct? Yes. All right.
Yes.
And is that about, so by rough back of the envelope, that's about 70% of the property.
Correct.
With the office buildings comprising the other 6 acres along the freeway frontage to remain.
Yes, so we would anticipate that there would most likely be a property line somewhere here.
Okay.
And
First-
everything north would be proposed for the high-density residential.
Oh, I'm sorry, one more time?
Everything north of that proposed or anticipated property line, this would all be the high-density residential site.
Okay, okay. Do you know what the square footage is respectively of the existing two, we'll call them the two industrial buildings?
Not offhand, no, but the applicant, I think, would probably have that information. I know their real estate agent is in the audience as well.
Okay, so if, let me pose another question, which the applicant may be ready to answer, but give you first shot. So I'm just wondering if the industrial buildings were currently fully utilized per existing zoning, approximately how many employees would be working on site and how many vehicles from those from the occupants of those two buildings would be on site? Do we know that answer?
No, it would really depend on the occupancy.
Yep. The density occupancy.
You mean the office buildings or the industrial?
No,
The industrial. Yeah, I'm just focused on the industrial. So, do we know how many parking spaces there are adjacent to those two industrial buildings?
I do know that the site is overparked, so if it were to be anticipated that it had industrial uses and office uses, there's still ample parking to support those uses there.
I've been out there, and did you use the term overpark?
Yes, meaning that there's a little surplus of parking.
Okay, I just learned a new term today. It seems to be a very large parking area. So, okay, well then maybe I'll reserve some time for the applicant and ask a couple more questions.
Does that finish your questions?
For now, yeah, thanks.
Anything down this way?
I have another question, if you would, please.
Mr.
Just one.
Kildy?
Joe, the high-density residential, does that typically mean apartments, or could it mean something else?
Usually if a developer is going to construct to the maximum density at high density, it does typically mean apartments. But there's a range. It goes from 18 units to acre up to 30. So if it's on the lower end, usually it's for sale.
Okay.
I have a couple, and following up with that one, and if you go back to the project that was approved down the street from it, which probably opened the door to all this, that one was originally brought to us as apartments, and not too far down the road, they switched it. Now they're now for sale units. So sometimes what you're told in the beginning doesn't end up being what happens in the end. I'd asked a question the other day. I don't remember what we were discussing when we started talking about vacancy rates and the need for industrial buildings, et cetera. And I asked staff to do some research on vacancy rates within our community on industrial, commercial, retail. And I'm assuming somebody brought that with them. Not you. I did. Good. Thank you, Mr. Trimley. Would you mind reading them too? I can do most of them off, but since you've got it so I don't mess it up, can you mind reminding us what those numbers are?
Relative to industrial vacancy rates?
Correct.
Yeah, and this is from the most recent CBRE report for fourth quarter 2016, and the vacancy rate for Camarillo for existing industrial properties over 10,000 square feet is 4.5%.
And commercial is the big one, right?
Office?
Office, uh-huh.
Oh, yes, that's much bigger. That's running, according to this, it's in the 31% range.
Right, big.
And then retail is even more than industrial, if I'm not mistaken.
Retail is more than industrial.
And we always thought our retail was full, you know. So I guess the point I'm trying to make, that from an industrial standpoint, our vacancy rate is actually quite low. And so for anyone to tell us that we don't need industrial property, to me isn't.
Let me, can I?
No, I'm
I got
talking.
to.
Excuse
I know,
me,
but
Mr.
when you're through,
Morgan.
I'd like to answer that.
Because I think there's this idea that we don't need any more industrial, and if it's only 4% and these are vacant, my guess is that a lot of that vacant space are these particular buildings. And if you don't want to lease your building and you leave it vacant, that doesn't mean that it can't be leased. It's sometimes their own choice. So with that, I'm going to move on to our speaker sheets.
I'm sorry, I had one question.
Oh, I'm
after
sorry.
Mr. Tremblay asked his questions. So the question was about the parking for the industrial. The two office buildings in the front, if the line were put where you had it, how much parking would be left for the two office buildings? Because when those were fully full, parking was very difficult. That's why I'm asking about that. When you had Blue Cross or Anthem or whatever the thing was in the one and taking up a good part of the other, and whatever the software company was in the other end, on the west end of that other building, with the one with the white roof, you could hardly find a parking place out there.
So once the property line is established, we will analyze the parking configuration to make sure that it meets the minimum parking requirements for any industrial buildings that are proposed to remain. So that's to be determined.
Okay. Well, let's start with Mr. Hardgrave again, who is representing the applicant. We'll start with you.
Good evening, Mayor McDonald and members of the City Council. Dennis Hardgrave. I'm representing Camino Ruiz, which is Steve Zimmerman, and Mr. Zimmerman was here for the first night of GPA hearings and had toughed it out until we realized we weren't coming on. And he apologizes for not being able to be here tonight, but he has a college event with his daughter, so it was. We were trumped. So with that, we'll move ahead. I might also point out that Mr. Zimmerman owns 5 additional industrial buildings in Camarillo besides this complex, and and he is a real fan of Camarillo. So he is heavily invested in this community. We've met with staff several times with him. He's taken a whole lot of efforts to repurpose this property since he's purchased it. But if I could walk through just a little bit of a very brief presentation. I believe you may have a small flip book that matches this that you got, 11 by 17s.
Yeah.
Let me just give you a real brief overview here. First of all, the site, you can see the location, as staff's pointed out, the 129 townhomes, I believe it is, in the project immediately adjacent, and the project which is under construction now. And then beyond that, the commercial and retail area, which is a pretty well-developed and pretty thriving, at least by day, retail area to that side. You'll also note in this first picture, you'll note that there are a large number of government offices located along this Verdugo Way area. It's become very interesting over the past decade or so. You've probably noticed it as well, that a number of agencies that are county-wide governmental agencies that probably don't need to be at the government center found that this was a great central location for people for the entire county, and so they've relocated to this area. So it's transitioned from industrial to office compared to what this was 25 years ago when it first started. This proposal covers 14 acres. 6 acres of it are office, as staff had said, would remain as a buffer to any residential development and providing a setback there. And the plan is to rezone the 14 acres to high density, and the initial plan for this is apartments. We would work closely with staff and with council to create the designation and firm that designation up by the final documents, however it's determined it works best. You'll notice all the employers that are in here. There are well over 1,000 employees in this neighborhood, so that's one thing we know. We can't get a firm count. Many of them are private companies that don't publish that. The second exhibit here shows the access of this site. That in effect, as we look at it, it's that circles that you see both directions, that's a quarter-mile distance. And that quarter mile represents what we in the planning field recognize as the easy walking distance that people will use to get to goods and services or go back and forth So you'll notice that most of the employment centers are within a quarter mile of the site, and all of the retail services are within a quarter mile of the site. That's one of the reasons we think that it's a logical location to consider additional residential, because you have a high daytime population that most of them get in their cars and drive away somewhere else to live and get on our freeway every day. Additionally, in the site plan, we would show having a parking buffer of 100 feet. That would be consistent with what we did at Village at the Park, as you recall. But there was a Constitution Avenue Industrial, and we did a buffer along there, which was the RV parking area. And I have not heard a resident. I'm on both homeowners association boards. I have never had anybody come to me and complain on the board about noise from the industrial uses beyond that, and I've not had any industrial users say we can't function there because of it. That's why this 100-foot minimum buffer we think is an important thing to do if you're planning for distances between new uses. Additionally, this plan would call for preserving the mature trees along Verdugo Way and along Camino Ruiz. And we would create a public plaza, an entry plaza at this area. This neighborhood is sorely missing any public open space. If you notice this, when you see all the people that walk during lunch hour, if you've been in that neighborhood, there's no sidewalks, there's no way to get from the industrial neighborhoods and these office parks without walking either through parking lots or in the road. There's no sidewalks in Verdugo Way east of Camino Ruiz. So this project would then introduce a pathway to connect the office to the retail within the entire frontage of this area. Moving on, this is just a detail we provided for you. This would be a conceptual size and scale of the plaza. The plaza would be usable for daytime as a lunch hour gathering place for people as they're out. Just to give you a sense of size of that, the small food court on the other side of the street, that's the parking lot of the food court. That's the scale of that. This is the scale of the plaza we're talking about. So in other words, you know, what they have over there right now is this, and that project has no real usable outdoor open space. You know, there's no gathering points in this community of any kind at this point. The path would activate the street. It would provide a safety for pedestrians. And in terms of, you know, how it would fit in with this the current residential project, we do have a letter of support from the adjacent property developer Comstock, and they're here tonight to speak about this. And then as we go on, just to give you a sense of scale of the plaza, these are local plazas that you would recognize. The upper ones are both in Village, are shots of the one at Village at the Park across from the YMCA. You know how open that corner feels? That's about the scale of this one. And also the distance from the Panera store back over to the edge of the parking area. So kind of give you a sense, if you stand in those, these would be much larger open spaces than currently exist anywhere in this, other than on the county schools conference center site. They have a plaza, you know, on their own side of the site. Just two more slides quickly here, and I can answer questions. This is our concept for the Verdugo Way pedestrian trail. You can see at this photograph there is no sidewalk anywhere as you go past Camino Ruiz. We would be proposing keeping the trees. This is a wintertime picture. Those are deciduous trees. So the trees would remain, and then the sidewalk would be behind that. And then any parking or building forms would be behind that as it happened. As we've said, there is not a safe connection between the retail and the office areas at this point. Lastly, the rationale for this project. The two buildings that were referenced, that Mr. Tremblay asked about, were built for a defense contract years ago. Some of you will remember that. They were built for a defense contract, and one of those was a unique bunker building, which is partly submerged or partly below ground, and that function does not exist anywhere off base anymore. The function that served, the military decided that if they were ever going to use that type of building again, it's going to be on their own property. So the broker has tried many creative ways to deal with that. And
Tell them how big it was.
what's that?
Tell them how big it was.
I believe the building itself is 75,000 square feet, 3 stories, concrete reinforced, and it's underground. Yeah,
Well, that was underground.
pretty tough to find
Yeah.
a tenant for that. At one point, maybe an internet switching building might have been something functional there, but that business is not. That's not something going anymore. Yeah, bomb shelter. Yeah, so a few other uses like that. Those two buildings total about 185,000 square feet, and cumulative, not the 2 front office buildings, but the 2 back ones. And I would say that that's far under the allowable zoning capacity for that site. If you took 14 acres and had about a 40% coverage in industrial building, you would wind up with, probably closer to 300,000 square feet in 1 story of industrial and meet the parking requirements. The site, according to the broker, has over 1,100 parking spaces. The reason it was full was because the second building, I'm sorry I don't have those on my pictures here, but the larger of the 2 buildings, not the bomb shelter, but the other building was 110,000 square feet. And it was jammed packed full of cubicles for Anthem Blue Cross employees who filled up that parking lot in multiple shifts. Any normal industrial user, that's like 5 times as much parking as you need normally, because you park at like 3 spaces per 1,000 in most industrial developments.
Dennis, I don't mean to interrupt you, but could you show
Yeah.
me on here where that is? Would you mind?
It would be right in here is the industrial building, and I can't switch back to the other staff presentation, but the 110,000 square foot building's about here, and the bunker's right about here.
And do those
And then
stay?
everything else is parking lot.
Those
There's
go, okay.
something over the bunker, too.
Pardon?
There was some little building over the bunker.
Yes, there was, above ground portion of it, yeah. But the front buildings here are the ones we're talking about retaining and enough parking to support them to their office capacity. Contrary to what some of us thought when we didn't know anything about this site, or at least me personally, all those Anthem employees weren't in these 2 tiny buildings up here at the front. They were warehousing, much like they did in Newbury Park with thousands more employees up there, the same kind of approach. Finally, on the rationale, to build offices, as you've just talked about, is not rational at this site. We have a 30% vacancy rate. These have been bargain hunters in here that have bought existing buildings and repurposed them for the most part, and that's how those industrial buildings have turned into office buildings. And now that we have an office neighborhood developed in here, and we have a residential neighborhood over here, we have the odd situation of, does it make sense to build more industrial buildings right here in this area when everybody else is office on the other side of it? I'm not sure that in the era of SOAR, when we're going to be repurposing underutilized sites in the future, this may be long-term one of those sites we should be looking at to repurpose, because it's able to accommodate a number of residential units at a location that doesn't impact an existing neighborhood. Quite often, one of the conflicts we come into when we start looking at repurposing areas, we up the density in a neighborhood, and then people that live next door to it go, well, there goes the neighborhood. This is a site that would not negatively impact adjacent homeowners or anything, so it's a little different in that regard. It's also near services. It's near a huge employment base, which I would guess a number of those people would be likely tenants for an apartment project in the neighborhood if you have more than 1,000 employees in the area. It would ultimately create less peak hour traffic to have residential at this site than knocking this down and building 300,000 square feet of industrial or an office building. So interestingly, the trip generation would be less, not even considering any internal trip gain we might have from having this use in the site. And again, the owner owns multiple buildings in the area. He's committed to the community, and he wants to be a good neighbor, and he intends to continue working with the city. Broker's here tonight, and he will give you a little bit of brief background. I'm sorry I ran so long, but a brief background on the number of people who have looked at this site and said thanks, but no thanks. It's very challenging. Mr. Vaca's met with any number of those people, I'm sure, and he could probably attest to as well. So thank you. Here to answer any other questions, or come back at the end if you want me to.
We have questions?
I have one. At the end of the, so everybody knows, at the end of where that line is, the yellow line at the east end, all the property over there is vacant, is all is zoned industrial, and it's Haas Automation owns all that, correct?
Haas Automation through an entity that Mr. Haas owns that, correct.
So all that
Trilliad
empty land-
Investment, I think, is what it is.
All the empty land over there is industrial.
There is empty industrial land.
Yes.
I'm guessing it's at least 30 acres. I
Right.
wouldn't want to say for sure. So there is industrial vacant. There is a 4.5% overall vacancy factor. You're correct from the CBRE study. But there are these vacant parcels that are available. I think they have approved buildings on all of them that have never been built, if I'm not correct. Additionally, there is behind the the last phase of the outlets, there's another industrial property, if you recall, that's west of the Star, that's an industrial property that's vacant and unbuilt. And there's been no, I know the owner of that property very well, and that property owner has not been able to, pencil a project to be built based on the rents. One thing we get very low industrial rent rates here, I think, compared to a lot of other areas as well. So,
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Mr.
But I
Kilby?
was wondering if I could ask it after everybody else has spoken, and maybe Dennis, you can come back and
Oh, sure.
answer it if that would be appropriate.
Yeah, he's representing the applicant, so we can certainly have you back.
I'll ask my question.
Okay, all righty. Our next speaker, David Laletta? Am I close?
Good evening, Mayor, council members. Name is David Laletta. I'm with Comstock Homes. And I'm here tonight to represent the property that's just to the west that has the residential. And we're in support of the GPA referral. And I also wanted to share with you to give you a little bit of feedback on how is the public reacting to the residential project. We're currently in land development phase, but we did open a small sales office trailer, and so we started to do some pre-sales and some pre-marketing of the project. And we are getting a very strong response, and we've actually already had sales of several units. And interesting enough, some of the units are what we had called the buffer buildings along the freeway there. So we are getting good acceptance. And what's kind of surprising with the minimal advertising that we're doing, other than just one sign on Verdugo, there is, as Dennis mentioned, quite a bit of foot traffic along Verdugo. And it could be just people doing exercise walks during their breaks, but we're also getting pretty decent traffic on the weekends also. And it might be coming from the other side on the residential, and they're doing a loop all the way around. So the project is being well accepted. Our price points are where we thought they were on the project, and we definitely would think it would be added value from the standpoint of the property across the street from us on Camino Ruiz is an underutilization. It has a lot of open parking spaces, and we also foresee that the use of those industrial buildings, the way they're constructed, will be challenging. And if there was another use, and high-density residential would be additive, especially with the improvements along that intersection right there. And I'm here for any questions you might have on our project, too.
Thank you. Any questions? I have a couple. Can you tell us what your price points are on those since you
Sure.
brought it up?
We're in the 400s, low 400s to 475, I think it is.
Okay. And when you originally came to us, you came much like this with apartments being planned, and then you quickly switched to townhomes. Can you tell us why?
Sure, and I actually didn't do the referral. We purchased it from a group that had Joel Manley involved in it, and they had actually processed 4 apartments, and I think it was around 227 or so in apartments.
Yeah.
And the struggle with the apartments was the configuration of the project, and also the city needing the separation in the middle of the project and the connection to the adjacent hotel space. So what happened with the apartments was they couldn't quite configure the apartments to the most efficient configuration, and they just were not getting what they needed from an apartment layout at that density. And we looked at it because we're predominantly home builders. We also do apartments, but predominantly home builders. And we knew the popularity of the townhomes and people wanting to buy homes, and proposed it as a for sale when we purchased it. So that's, I believe, the evolution, and staff probably has some background on that. So we went from 227 to 129 is what the count.
Excuse me.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Oh, by the way, one question, just one question. Sorry. I'm sorry, I caught a cold tonight. It just hit me this afternoon. On the corner, that's a beautiful corner you drew.
I think that's his corner.
I'm sorry. He's working on it, apparently, with those people.
He's
apparently. Anyway,
Next
at the
door.
Verdugo Way and Camino Ruiz, how big is that parcel there? It looks like a nice little park, but how large is that?
I think that's Mr. Hargrave's
1 acre, half
question.
acre?
You need Mr. Hargrave.
Dennis?
Yeah, Dennis, that's actually designed.
I just want to
That
know
corner.
how big that piece. It looks pretty big, like almost as big as a park. Just curious.
Let's see back here.
That one.
Yeah, it's basically more than 10,000 square feet. I can tell you that. The minimum dimension's 100 feet in each direction as you're looking at it. So it's not really a park. It's more like a pocket park, like you'd see in a,
Picnic type.
more than a tot lot, but
Yeah.
a pocket park kind of approach. But and then again, that's just it really goes with a trend we're seeing in a number of multifamily communities. If you, I don't know what you've seen in different conferences or whatever, but a number of communities are pushing some of the open space out to the public edge because they're finding millennials want to be on an active zone as opposed to always buried in a rec area in the middle of an apartment project. So we're finding that a lot of the common open area, even the private or the public open space in these projects is being pushed out to the street edge in some cases where it's a little more usable. So there would be quite a bit more. There'd be code required open space further within this property. This is just, here's a detail on the edge. I don't feel like it's appropriate when I'm doing a GPA referral to throw a detailed site plan up. It kind of, we get lost in the weeds of it. I'd prefer to say these are the concepts and opportunities we see. But that's, again, we just see it at least a 10,000 square foot area out there. So think of that a couple of lots or more,
Good.
Again, it's very comparable in size to the one across from the YMCA, if not larger.
Okay.
No, it's not. It sounds big. Thank you. The next speaker is Paul Ferry. I think those are 2 R's.
Thank you, Mayor McDonald and council members. My name is Paul Ferry. I am the broker. I wonder if we couldn't have maybe the earlier staff slide with the buildings depicted. That might help the next
I'll have to check with my broker on that.
While they're doing that, could you pull the mic up a little bit, please? Thank you.
Is it better?
Yes.
That might help. And I'm imagining that it's going to be a little bit of Q&A at the end of mine because I've been the broker on this. And I sold this property to ZDI 3 years ago. And when we first look at the property, he's a very imaginative guy, very creative. He's done a lot of repurposing of projects in L.A., most of them from industrial to artist lofts and residential in downtown L.A. And when we looked at this, it sort of screamed of campus. And as Mr. Vaca knows, we've had a lot of those types of people through the property. The community colleges, we had schools, the Seventh-day Adventists looked at it. We also had a scooter manufacturer. I've probably been to the property 60 times in the last 3 years looking for somebody to occupy those buildings. But there's a term we use in industrial called functional obsolescence, and these buildings describe that. The large building where there was a sort of a boiler room operation for the medical people, that's 112,000 square feet. It was full of office employees, and that's why, again, the parking at that time was packed. We call the other building the bunker building. It has a skiff at the basement, 25,000 feet. That was in case of a nuclear attack. It was when Unisys/Burroughs built that building. They were actually sworn to secrecy, but they were monitoring Southeast Asian airspace from that building. Yep. So those 2 buildings are functionally obsolete. And we looked at many different ways. We had many different people. We couldn't lease it to anyone. Steve spent a lot of money actually gutting the inside of the 112. Probably 80,000 square feet is free span now, free clear space, but it's 14-foot clear. And so a warehousing distribution type person doesn't really want that kind of space. And the bunker building, again, there's one window in the entire building, 3 stories, and they had people working in there. I've gone maybe a little bit beyond my time here, but I want to make sure that you guys know that at the bottom of Springville, the new spec building he's just leased, Steve put in 7,000 square feet of office, and we just leased that building to Landsberg, the packaging paper people, and he's committed to this area. He's committed to seeing this project being successful. But as much as I'd like, and I'm an industrial broker, I'd love him to spec 300,000 square feet of industrial, because that's what I do. But based on what Comstock's done, and based on the fact that we believe that a lot of the people that work in that area would like to walk to work, I think the highest and best use is actually residential. But if you have any questions specifically about the vacancies or the configuration of the property, the information you, Council Member Tremblay, that came from us. And vacancy is a little bit different than availability, but it's getting better.
Good. Questions?
Yes, thanks. Okay, so we've got 2 buildings. One's about 112, and the other must be about 73 then, mental math, about 185,000 aggregate?
Yes.
Roughly. So I found myself reading the staff report. If the industrial buildings, maybe I have to have you go back in time when they were fully utilized, but if they go back in time, if they were fully utilized per existing zoning, roughly how many employees would be working in those buildings? Is there any way to know?
Well, the dumbed-down version of how many parking spaces are work for industrial is 2 per 1,000. R&D is 3 per 1,000. So if you're doing basic distribution, and actually Camarillo was the lead in this creative way to look at the parking, and Camarillo typically will give you need 4 per 1,000 for office, 1 per 1,000 for a warehouse area, and 2 for manufacturing. When you average those in and you're building a spec building, for instance, 2 per 1,000 usually gets it. But literally speaking, you can multiply the square footage by 2 and guess how many employees there would be. It's been a long time since these were typical industrial uses, and that's why the buildings don't really work.
Right. And the parking area was about 1,100 parking spaces, roughly.
In total on the entire 20-acre site.
Right. Where I was going with this is one way to there's all kinds of prisms to look through this, but one prism is to compare and contrast. In other words, how many people would be anticipated to occupy a rezoned 14-acre site in a high-density residential configuration, such as is being suggested for referral now, on a net basis after deducting a certain percentage of the acreage for for common areas, et cetera, and how many vehicles would be on site. So I don't know if I can go apples to apples or not, but I found myself wondering, if those are fully utilized right now, what would we be looking at as opposed to an ultimate project based on a referral?
Well, I'm not a residential broker, honestly, and I don't have a clue, and I try and stay away from that kind of enterprise, and I just do industrial. They call us dock-high dummies, and there's a reason for that. But as far as the occupancy, the occupancy in industrial, you can't foresee probably more than 300,000, 600 parking spots, 650, if it was repurposed, and those buildings are going to get raised regardless. In fact, in the analysis of actually breaking this off, the 2 office buildings in the front, which need to be parked 4 per 1,000, that you were probably looking at, I'd say about 650,000 square feet. And we would have had to chop off part of that building just to create those lots anyway. So those buildings need to be raised. They need to come down.
Right. I was just trying to go through the mental exercise of contrasting, okay, if those are fully occupied and booming right now, what would by contrast be if we were to go to high-density residential?
Well, the offices would be 4 per 1,000 and still will be, and there's 40,000 square feet each. So,
okay.
So I don't know. Dennis might be able to answer the question on residential parking densities, and I have no clue about that.
I'll throw it at him later. Okay.
Well, tell us, just add up the ones that the industrial is fully used right now, industrial and the front buildings also. What do you think it would be used? I mean, if it were full right now, what would be the parking needs of that area right now?
Well, most likely it would be 2 per thousand on the back, and it would be 4 per thousand on the front. So and the math would be, you've got, let's say you've got 200,000 on the back, so you got maybe 400 parking spots.
Uh-huh.
And the front's 4 per thousand, so that's 160 each. That's 320. 720 to 750 is a pretty good guess.
Let's just say
total on site.
Let's just say 700, and we'll use that. Okay.
I have a question.
Your Honor. Oh, wait, we have some more.
Your Honor, I think what we're trying to get to, it's not really parking. We're looking at the amount of traffic. Yep. Is that really the bottom line we're trying to?
That's the bottom line.
That's the bottom line.
Okay, so I have to see if I can brush some rust off here. Let's just concentrate on the 14 acres that would change. And I believe I heard that if the buildings were raised and you look at normal floor area ratio, you're looking at about 300,000 square feet of light industrial. Looking at trip generation factors, and we tend to look at the peak hours as being the most critical periods to understand what the impacts of traffic has. Looking at a peak hour for light industrial, 300,000 square feet, would generate somewhere between 300 and 600 peak hour trips.
Right.
For residential, for apartments, and let's go to the extreme. Let's assume that somehow they are able to fit the 30 units per acre, and you're looking at 14 acres. That's 420 units. Your average or your peak hour rate for an apartment is a half a trip. You tend to get trips more concentrated at a business in the peak hours. With residential, you have people arriving and leaving at different times. So if you're looking at 420 units at a half a trip per unit, you're looking at 210 trips. So if you look at just sheer peak hour traffic, that alone would show that the residential would be less. The other important factor we look at is the directionality of the flow. If you have an area that currently is primarily concentrated with businesses, you have a lot of inbound traffic in the morning and a lot of outbound traffic in the evening. And so it's not just the amount of traffic, but is that traffic all concentrated in one direction, and then that direction becomes the congested flow of traffic. With residential being a contraflow, you would have people leaving in the morning instead of arriving, and then generally coming back in the evening. You may actually get a better balance of traffic in and out of the area, because now you have a mix of industrial businesses and residential. That's the type of analysis, and that's why you look at referrals to say that, now an expert's going to evaluate all that and bring back more detail. But just at first blush, I can tell you that the amount of traffic impact with residential is probably going to be significantly less than if it were to be a fully utilized site with light industrial. Regional traffic, I'll just touch on that as well, and that's something that's looked at as a jobs housing balance. Right now, there are a lot of, I believe there was an economic study for the county that identified that Camino has a lot of trips coming into the city to business or employment-related trips. If you have housing to create a little more of a local jobs housing balance, you may actually offset some of and reduce some of the trips on the freeway compared to if this were to build as industrial site. Again, more that can be analyzed by experts and brought back to you in more detail, but at least it seemed to be an issue that has come up a couple times tonight, so I wanted to give a little more detail to confirm that Mr. Hargrave's assessment that the impacts of residential from a traffic standpoint would probably be less.
Question. Tom, I have a question for you. If you're looking at this also from the fact, and it was brought up, that there would be people that were in the all industrial area that might have apartments or go to those, use those apartments. That would not reduce the amount of traffic for the area because of the residential.
That is correct. I used a worst case example of the highest end density of 30 per acre, and assuming all of the traffic would leave the area. There is in the industry an expectation, they call them internal trips or linked trips. When you have residential and businesses near each other, you tend to get some trips that are not by vehicle, but people can walk or bicycle, and so that will reduce the amount of traffic on the road to even less than the numbers I gave you.
Mr. Kildee?
Yes, the industrial buildings there, how long have they been vacant, those two? Do you know?
I'd say 4.5 years. Yep. The back was 4.5 years because the last occupant was the Blue Cross Anthem people. They left the property when Kilroy owned it. Kilroy then sold to LBA. LBA's got their own problems down the street with an interesting building that doesn't know what it wants to be. It doesn't know if it's industrial or office. The office market's terrible, and frankly, in Camarillo and the whole West County. About 4.5 years it's been vacant. And I want to add one other item on the traffic. I would not recommend that my client build anything there that didn't have truck high, so dock high positions. So there would definitely be more truck traffic in that area. And that's one of the things that Dennis spoke to earlier with the conversion of that park. You've got Haas on one side with 20 acres of industrial, but the conversion of that park to more of an office R&D park, it's not basic industrial anymore. That was what was contemplated potentially by Pardee originally. That's right. But I would want dock high in today's world in a building, and that would attract truck traffic, frankly. I like truck traffic. Not everyone else does.
But not necessarily a freight company, just someone who wants to back their own truck into it.
Suggest it was a freight company, but
it's a big difference.
One other additional element here is that is in a floodplain area down there at the end. And he'd probably have to have a dock high area to get past that.
Is that true?
In the whole area. Not the whole thing, isn't.
I don't think it goes that far. I have a question having to do with going back to the parking. So if we're going back to industrial, and I believe you said 720 to 750 parking spots. So I'm going to go the other direction, and I'm going to say that without carpooling, that should be 700 to 750 employees, jobs for Camarillo. So we got to look at the other side. Do we want to simply be a residential town, or do we want to actually create jobs? And that's why this was not zoned residential in the beginning. It was so that we could have a mix in our community. I'm now talking, not my question, but my question is, is what you're telling me, that 720 versus to 750 parking spots for
and I don't argue that point. I'm just saying because of the transformation, and I've been doing this for 30 years in this area, that you've got 20 acres on the other side in Haas, which is probably more appropriate for those buildings to get built. Depending on what happens with the Selleck property, if it gets lucky enough to get a regional retailer, then it's retail. Otherwise, it's industrial. And you've got the Chelsea piece, and you do have some other areas where that can happen. I think the Comstock project is really the landmark change in this particular area.
That's, in my opinion, the unfortunate part, that it opened the barn door, and now what's getting out. But that's my personal opinion. Any other questions? Thank you very much. And we do have one more speaker. That is John Dempsey.
Hi.
You may have to pull that up to you, the mic. Yeah, it's right there. You go.
Hi, my name's John Dempsey, 2159 Derby Street, Camarillo, California. I'm opposed to the Camino Ruiz proposal. 5151 Camino Ruiz. At one time, there were 1,200 Unisys employees in the Camarillo area, most located at this facility. I, as the very last Unisys employee in Camarillo, have worked in every building at this site. Camino Ruiz LLC is proposing to replace the current office space with high residential planned density, RPD, of 18 to 30 units per acre for 14 acres. As proposed, this equates up to 420 units with around 1,500 occupants. This also equates to around 1,200 additional cars using the 101 freeway on a daily basis. I have no sentiments on whether these buildings should stay as office buildings or be leveled and replaced with newer buildings, but I am strongly opposed to converting this area to residential. As you know, the 101 freeway parallels this location. As office buildings, the 101 is a major asset to whoever occupies this address, as it's clearly visible to the 101 freeway. Today, the existing office buildings provide a visual and sound buffer between the 101 and residential areas. This is prime location for a large business to move into Camarillo, which could provide high-paying jobs to our local residents. If replaced with residential units, the 101 is a major liability, where residents must endure the constant noise, exhaust, and view the traffic on the 101 freeway. For those commuting on the freeway, this development will be seen. Thousands will see these residents living on top of the 101 freeway as they drive by. Residents living here will have quick access to the 101 freeway. Most residents living here will justify longer commutes on the already congested 101 freeway instead of walking a quarter mile to their workplace, as just implied by the developer. Require residents who live here to walk to work, and these units will be vacant. No one wants to live near a freeway, but if you approve this development to convert prime office space to residential, people will live there. They will be forced to, because this is where the City Council approved a residential development. As a possible compromise, I would ask Camino Ruiz LLC to consider a 1031 commercial property exchange in Camarillo, which is next to existing residential, and develop new housing at this location away from the freeway. As office buildings, the 101 is a major asset. As residential units, the 101 is a major liability. I ask that you reject this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
I'm not sure where at 1031. I didn't follow that.
That's when you swap your exchange, you sell your property for another property. So that, in other words, sell this one and go buy it somewhere else to
Go buy another property and make more residential there. That's what he suggested.
And that's just something you do from a tax standpoint. Now you can trade your property and sell one and buy another from a tax standpoint.
Okay. Well, you'd have to find two buyers, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
you'd have to sell it, and there's a whole process you go through. You know, you'd have to have a seller as well.
Your Honor, there was mentioned 1,200 potential people living there and 1,200 cars hitting the road. I want to make sure that's changed, because every person in that residence won't have a car hitting the road at the same time. Won't happen.
Well, that's his opinion. Although, congratulations on being the last Unisys employee. That must have been an experience on its own.
We miss you.
You got to lock up the bunker and everything. Wow.
We miss Unisys. They were good.
Okay, those are all the speaker sheets I have. Would anyone else like to address the council on this particular one? We have a couple more. Mr.
I
Kildee?
had a question for Mr. Tremblay. I don't know if it's appropriate to...
For Mr. Tremblay or Mr. Hargrave?
I'm sorry, Mr. Hargrave.
Yes. He's representing the applicant, so it would be quite appropriate to bring him back.
I'll gladly yield my time to Mr. Tremblay. How's that? Yes, Dennis Hargrave.
Dennis,
again.
thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the apartments here.
Yeah.
Now, was there, and I understand the process there, we're just potentially referring it for more discussion, I get that. Was there any discussion about something other than apartments there? I know it had explained that the project adjacent to it to the west, that had somewhat had some maneuver on that. Had there been any discussion on anything other than apartments? And if there hadn't, economically, was it just penciled out the apartments were going to be the only thing that was going to work there?
No, there was discussion with Mr. Vaca regarding for sale housing at that location or rental housing at that location. I personally have a strong feeling that some of these sites that we're dealing with, you recently had one where it probably would have been a better apartment site than a for sale townhome site, in my view. But I just feel like there is a long-term need with this millennial generation and the workforce that we have to look at rental housing. I mean, I'm just a very strong advocate of it. I mean, we're looking at everything from student debt profiles long-term to mobility and the lack of interest in millennials as of this point in time to be owners, and the incredible bar to home ownership that exists in Ventura County. And a number of things have been said tonight about jobs housing balance and trip directions on freeways. I think that entire discussion itself is what merits this being referred, because it gives us a chance to look at a big enough module to deal with to address some of this issue on a site. It may ultimately come back, and that's a risk that this owner understands, that you say, no, this is not a residential site after all. But the alternative being what's allowed under the LM zoning and what the broker would recommend that we would come back with as a plan, we know that we'd be coming back with dock-high industrial buildings. And I can't promise you that that's not going to wind up being a logistics building. In other words, if that's a user who needs to be in this county, whether it's the Ciscos or whoever they are that need to do distribution. So in terms of other uses, we've looked at industrial, we've looked at for sale, we've looked at rental. I personally think rental is a direction that should be considered here. We would work closely with staff, and we've done study sessions as we've gone through these processes over the years, and I think that would be appropriate on this as it moved forward. So I hope that answers the question. I can be more specific if you'd like.
I don't want to get into too much discussion. Hybrid, perhaps, might be something that might be discussed. Yeah,
of for sale and rental, or even of a mixed use of some kinds. I mean, what's the highest and best use of how to blend that property? I mean, this is an extremely creative property owner. I have seen, he was one of the pioneers in the arts district in downtown Los Angeles. Numerous buildings, and developed. He was one of the early pioneers in what's now an extremely popular area that was not far from Skid Row, if you know where we're talking about, the arts district, and it was a huge success there. And while he's invested in new buildings here, like the one that was mentioned at Springville, that he's that's that newest building that's behind. I call it G&H Technology, I guess, the newest large building, and other buildings he owns in town in the Oxnard Plain as well. So. It would be very open to a creative process in terms of multiple alternatives. One of the advantages of a referral is instead of somebody just launching projects at you at the planning department, you can actually say, okay, let's study 2 or 3 different options or alternatives for this site under a GPA scenario. We're asking for this, but as we get into scoping, we decide, you know what? Let's analyze 2 or 3 different scenarios for this site. Wouldn't be unlike any other CEQA process where you have project and alternatives. So I'm sure he would agree to do that.
Thank you.
And can I follow up on that one? So you would be willing to study something other than residential, or are you just looking at different ways of putting the residential?
I think different ways of doing the residential is the primary thing, but I think it should probably be, to give it a really fair analysis by the end, we should probably look at what are the other holding capacities for this site. It's a general plan is a really fluid document, as we know. They're not as static as we think, and that you do have this as an opportunity to work through that process. I'd recommend it to him that he look at all the options on the table.
And is that how you're going to ask for the referral?
I am asking for it as with the proposal is to do high-density residential, because that's what he signed as an application. But I would say that I would strongly recommend that if it moves forward, that a range of options be looked at in the study process, and we would work with staff and the council and whatever group you want to have work on that.
Thank you. Mr. Moore?
One of the things that's brought to our attention tonight, and I spoke with my city manager about today, one of those needs that we do have, because they're full, those that are under 400,000 square feet, warehouses, small business warehouses, if you go to Constitution Street in Camarillo, that's about what they are. They're full. And so Constitution Ale moved out of the same kind of area. They outgrew it. But if that were mixed with some things like that, smaller warehouse uses are, warehouse, I got to call it storage, whatever. But you have some of that mixed with this, so we still can maintain some of that. Is that a possibility?
I'm open to. I mean, you know me. I'll study anything with you guys, and we'll analyze it, and we'll try to do a thorough job to get what this city needs, as opposed to just whatever a single-minded property owner comes to you and says, I must have this, or all hell breaks loose tomorrow. That's not this guy's MO.
Well, I know it's zoned for industrial. I know you have to have it for trucks, and I really don't want to see more trucks coming out of there, to tell you the truth.
It would certainly have an impact on the traffic flow rates coming in and out of that intersection. I mean, I defer to the city public works director and the assistant city manager on traffic issues, but I do know that trucks coming away from a stoplight compared to cars leaving a stoplight certainly impact negatively that ability for that Verdugo stoplight to work.
Well, Charlotte, I think, will remember, like I did, when that place was a little more active, that corner of Santa Rosa Road and Verdugo, not Verdugo, what is that street that crosses there?
Adolfo?
Adolfo. No, not Adolfo. I'm talking about the one that goes in front of this thing here.
Camino Ruiz.
Yeah, Camino Ruiz, and that was busy. It was all busy all the way back to the corner. We were even asking one time if a stoplight couldn't come in because it's so busy. That wasn't good. And so that's what I'm saying. If we can do something that's a combination that might, accommodate that so we don't have traffic big time at the wrong times, would be better.
I would certainly encourage him to do that, and if we, I would certainly be completely supportive of that, and I'm certain he would agree to that.
I have to ask a question on the traffic, or maybe make a point. When you have a concentration of business, and I work in the financial area in Oxnard, in the towers, and it's 5 o'clock, there's traffic because you've got people working there. So to say, we're going to have businesses because we don't want traffic, I mean, that goes with having a business. So that happens to be my neck of the woods. I get on that freeway every morning at Santa Rosa Road, and I hit the stoplights at Verdugo and Adolfo, and I pass it every morning. It's no different than what I get when I get to the where you work. I mean, it's just, that's life, unfortunately, that we have traffic, and you don't get to have the road to yourself. And if you're going to have businesses, you're going to have traffic.
Right.
Mr. Chimley, did you have questions for Mr. Hardgrave?
No, just comments.
Okay. Anything else you need to tell us before you sit down?
I believe that's it. Or again, thanks for the time, and again, I do know that the property owner intends to work very closely with you on whatever process moves forward. But we would hope we could at least do a referral and do a thorough study on it, because long term, I think it will meet a residential need potentially that's going to exist long term in the city. And obviously, all of this we know takes 3 years, before a project comes back and allotments ever happen, if something gets referred. So which means it's 2 more years or 3 more years before it's built. So these things are very long term, and there's absolutely, as you've told me many times, there's no assurance that anything gets approved. This is a referral. So we understand that, and so does the property owner. Thank you.
Can I ask one more before you walk away? And I wrote this down just to make sure I'm right. This current property owner bought this just 3 years ago. So this isn't the
closed
long
on
term.
it 3.5 years ago. Yes.
3 years. Okay.
Yes.
So this isn't the
he's-
long term owner.
He's the same person who requested the general plan amendment referral in 2014.
Yes, and it had been owned by somebody else who had been trying to rent it and was unable to rent it prior to that.
So he bought it at this almost exactly the same time he bought it. He came in here and asked for a referral to residential. So this wasn't after years of trying to.
15? Yeah. He came in 15, I believe it was January 15 for the referral.
It was in 15.
Okay.
Yeah.
It says 14 in the staff
I
report.
remember.
No,
It's
that's
been a
wrong.
number.
That's
It's been
wrong.
a few years ago.
He came in last year and asked for it to be referred, and we didn't refer it.
I don't think it was last. It wasn't in 16.
It was last year.
I think it was 2, I think.
It wasn't
but,
in 16.
Might have been 15, but
It was.
14.
that's what it says in the staff report.
Yes.
I saw him in here earlier than that. Come in here and wanted a consideration, but there was a movie theater. You remember the movie studio? I forgot. I was going to say this because there was a motion picture studio that was thinking for a year about moving into this place, and I know that's why when you came in, I said no. We got a chance of a motion picture studio coming in. But they couldn't raise. They had raised 20, but they needed more money, and they couldn't raise it, so it's gone.
No, they couldn't.
But that was last year.
They were not financed.
So
That never came in as a referral. Mr. Vaca, can you please confirm that for us? You're the one that processes these things.
Yes, it was in 2014.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. All right, any more questions? So discussions? You want to start, Mr. Trimley?
Sure, why
wanna
not?
be
No,
first or
I'll crawl out on my limb first. So
I've gotten a good education tonight on vacancy rates relative to industrial properties, and just with respect to that issue in and of itself, we have the CBRE statistics that were quoted previously. I understand anecdotally that for Western Ventura County, depending on the size, if the industrial space is under 1,000 square feet or under, and I'm looking at the broker as I say this, who may be nodding or shaking his head, that's about a 2 to 3% rate, as opposed to larger industrial spaces over 1,000 square feet, probably running around 6%. That's my understanding anecdotally. But I'm sitting here contrasting the anecdotal evidence of vacancies with what is currently in the pipeline in the city. So we have, as I understand it, a construction of a 27,000-foot industrial building in the Mission Oaks area, and plans for about a 55,000-foot spec building on West Verdulera. So there appears to be some level of demand and some significant level of demand for industrial space, notwithstanding what was indicated in the application. So it's kind of difficult to reconcile the information, and I don't think there's much more I can do with it than that. So I'm going to leave that aside and go from there. I think the council previously, as I understand it, and I wasn't here, denied the applicant's referral request in 2014, primarily, as I understand it, on land use incompatibility grounds. And I know we have this Comstock development just to the west, but I suppose one could ask logically, aside from the pending development of the adjacent Teso Robles residential project, what has changed? And if I'm understanding it, it may be simply a matter of market conditions for the owner. This is a tough one for me. This area has long been set aside for industrial commercial. So some principal questions are whether a higher density rental housing at this particular site makes sense from a traffic standpoint, and I understand the peak. I understand the assertion in the applicant's materials relative to a potential for reduction in peak hour traffic if you compared it to what's currently allowable, which is what I was trying to get to before, but in a more roundabout way, admittedly. And I also understand Mr. Dempsey's argument relative to potential impacts on 101. And there's a concern about necessarily whether it's compatible with the area. So, I have this concern that and I know we're only talking about a study and a referral tonight, but if it were ultimately approved, whether it would encourage a domino effect of replacing industrial commercial with residential in the area. Now, that's on one side. On the other side, and the mayor and I can discuss reasonably. No, that's fine. But no, what is affordable housing and how do you define it? We all define it differently. That said, this city needs affordable housing, and the location is within the city's core. This is not greenfields development like Springville. It's essentially redevelopment within the city's existing footprint, which makes a difference to me. In terms of site repurposing and infill development. I also think, obviously, I'm interested in affordability. I am hoping that if this project is referred, one of the options that would be studied would be a smaller size, if it's multifamily, a smaller size multifamily unit that is maybe a studio size for a significant number of these units. I think it costs less to develop this property in terms of multifamily or high-density residential than it would on an unimproved property. I think there are different. Anyway, I would encourage looking at multiple options. So, on balance, my desire to at least look at this from whether or not it makes sense from an infill development standpoint outweighs my concern about other aspects. So I can support this for referral. That said, I've got a big caveat. This is a study process and a referral process that should not be construed as a vote for the project itself. I've got significant concerns regarding traffic, the neighborhood, the character of the neighborhood. I like that little 10,000 feet corner thing, but just in all seriousness, I have concerns about the neighborhood. I think it's got a long ways to go, but I would be in support of a referral.
Thank you. You want to work this way, Mr. Morgan? Anything?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. The last time he came through here, and I saw him right out there, when they were trying to come through and talk about referring theirs. And that wasn't that long ago. And I know that because he was here when they're trying to do the movie studio. And I was against it totally, against his doing what he wanted to do. Because I thought we had not industrial, but a use here that has off hours. Because movie studios do it in the nighttime too. And so it's not hitting peak traffic hours. And I thought that was great, but it didn't make it. Now I'm seeing some things I kind of like, because that corner you had there is so nicely landscaped like a little park. Of course, that's going to improve that look of that area. Secondly, if we put in some of those smaller uses of warehouses, which we need, like he's telling you, you go around, you won't find them. People want small warehouses to do their beginning of a company. That's what we need, biggest need we have. I traveled around town. I don't care how you say our vacancy is on the big warehouses. I counted 5 around the Camino Ranch, and I'll take you around and show them to you. They're big ones. They're bigger than 10,000 square feet, empty. 5 of them, right along, what do you call it, Flynn Road, all the way down to Camino House. Just on my way home, there were 5 I counted, big buildings vacant. And I can take you some other places in Camino, show the bigger ones. Not 10,000 square feet, that's big, but these are big. Poncho Road's got a couple, 3 of them. And there's even open fields there where they can build on it, and it's got a sign on it for sale. So there's a lot of industrial we can build in or make use or can fill. And that's what we're trying to do. That 4 point whatever you used was 10,000 or under. Oh yeah, because that gets in the range of people that need them. But the big ones are having problems. So you know, I think I'd like to refer this to see what else you can do with that property. You heard when I'm talking about needs, and that can be mixed in this real easy. One of the things I'm also worried about is, and this was talked about earlier, no park. Now, I'm bringing it back to you so you have an argument. No park, and if you're going to use this as no park, you can't use the other. You can't say this without looking at the one that we just argued, okay? But there might be some places in here. The park here is that's a quarter of a mile, about half a mile from here is the next park. But that's something to concern, but I like these green areas you had in the front and the walkways and all that stuff. That helps offset that a little bit. But anyway, I'm ready to refer it to see what you can do with it to come back and satisfy us. That's it.
Mrs. Craven?
Well, I think this is going to be really interesting. I didn't ask a whole lot of questions because a few years ago when I voted to refer the property that's under construction or underwater right now, I think they're trying to build something that it looks like Lake Camarillo when you come down the grade. At any rate, with a bunch of construction equipment in it. I voted to do that as a test to see how it went, and it's still under construction. It isn't anywhere near completion, and by the time this got there, I don't think it would be long enough. I think this, I'm not ready to refer this until I see how the other one turns out. If it were to happen that it were referred, and if it did come back residential, then I'm with Mr. Tremblay. These need to be smaller units. These things always turn out to be 4 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms. That's not what we need right now. We need some smaller units that are going to be more affordable. If we're talking housing for people who live in that area and who work in that area, I believe those people are smaller family people. A lot of single mothers needing another bedroom or maybe 2 kids in 1 bedroom. The world is going back to that now. I know as a landlord in a different part of town and other towns, a lot of people are downsizing because they can't afford to live where they have 1 bedroom for every person. And there's nothing wrong with that. But that's just the way the world is. So we do need to look at some smaller units. But I am not ready to support this.
Mr. Kildee?
Well, it's all the projects that we have left are the tough ones now, and that's what happens when you have a mature city, right? And I think our city has really, to a certain extent, built out, I think, in a very positive nature, and I thank everybody in here that had a piece to that. I think, and one of the questions I asked, are you stuck on just, the apartments, and do you have some wiggle room on something else? And the project to, let's see, it would be to the west of that, I didn't support because I was concerned about the freeway. I do share your concern about the freeway noise. This one is somewhat more buffered than that. As a businessman, I'd like to see industrial. Of course, I would. I'd love to see jobs. I'd like to see 100% of the people that are working age not only live in Camarillo, but work here. I think that would be a wonderful thing. We're definitely not there yet. We probably never will be, but that will always be a goal of mine. I think it is important that we put all the ideas on a table and have a discussion here. And I think this referral process would allow us to do this, knowing that we may not approve it. I've approved projects up here, and I have not approved projects in here. There is no guarantee for anything here, especially listening, like I've done for many years, to the council and their comments. You get a snapshot that a lot of us come from different parts, and we have different ideas, and I think that is great. I really do. I educate myself in every meeting that I go to. This is an unusual site here. I do like to have owner-occupied units here. I think you get more of a buy-in to our city when you can do that. I understand the apartment with the cost of things. I live with 2 millennials. I get where you're coming from with the millennials. They're way different than myself as a boomer. But we do have interesting discussions, I will tell you that. Again, I can support this with the caveat that other options are going to be discussed in here. I did talk a little bit about a hybrid with this. And if it doesn't work, that we, look at the industrial. We don't take the industrial completely off the table at this particular point here. I think in this kind of economy right now, we don't know really what the future is going to be for a lot of things right now. We're all sort of trying to do the best that we can with this. It's probably a 3-year process. When this was first developed, who knew that all these public employment jobs were going to come and buy these buildings? Maybe we look at public employment. Maybe that's where we need to look into the future. Last time I looked, they're pretty good jobs. So there's a lot of issues here. I think it's going to be some heavy lifting here. But I think we can start a discussion here, and we can see where this all end up. So with those comments and others, I will support that we move this forward for further discussion.
Well, I absolutely, obviously disagree with that. I think if the applicant listens to what you just heard come from 5 different council members, you got to think about spending all that money and not knowing where you're going to get, because I heard 5 different things as we worked our way down the council here. So I wish you good luck if it's referred. And it is an expensive thing to do. It isn't something that's cheap. And so to ask an applicant to go through that process, I mean, it's their risk. I mean, we're not guaranteeing anything, but it's not cheap, and it takes many years. I also go to our own staff. We've got so much stuff on the plate right now that you're asking our staff to process another one, and I don't think it needs to happen. This owner only bought this property 3 years ago, came in almost immediately asking to change it to residential. I think one of the comments I heard from one of the speakers is that seems to be one of the things he does, is buy underutilized industrial and then comes in and asks for the referral for high density residential. You make more money doing that, and that's what a lot of people we're seeing lately have been doing. Yeah, they did.
No, he didn't. He said he owns other industrial around the city.
And he also said that he converted other residential. He's shaking his head, yes, Mr. Morgan.
But that's not what he comes and buys them for.
I don't know what he did. All I'm doing is repeating what the man said. Excuse me. I think that this is an area that was designated in our general plan to be a light industrial park. What we need in this county, we may need affordable housing, but what we need are jobs. And if you look at the reports, if you look at the economic forecasts in this county, we need jobs and we need affordable housing, but jobs, jobs, jobs. And if we keep giving up our land that's zoned for creation of jobs, what are we going to be? We're going to be a bedroom community, and everybody's going to get on that freeway and go somewhere else. And to put this in the middle of an industrial area, up by the freeway, and I remember the day when we were going to make that corridor. We were going to be the new little southern Silicon Valley, and we had dreams of what that 101 corridor is, and now we're going to put houses on that prime commercial, industrial, job-creating corridor. To me is kind of sad. So obviously, having said that, you know that I am not in favor of referring this. I would gladly look at other uses that created jobs, but simply going in and turning it into residential. And remember, once we approve it and we give them the zoning, we can't stop them, just like the one on the corner. We can't stop them from switching from apartments to townhomes as long as they meet the zoning, and that's what happened with the one next door. And if you recall that day that was approved, and it wasn't a 5-0 vote on approving the Comstock piece, which wasn't Comstock at that point in time, and the fear is that we opened the floodgate, we opened the door, and then pretty soon we're just going to work our way down and lose our job-creating zoning. So with that, I obviously am not going to be supporting this. Anything else? Okay, what's the wishes of the council?
I'll move that we refer item number 4 for more study.
Second.
Okay, I have to have a clarification. The request is to change from industrial to high-density residential plan development. Is that what your referral is? That's the request.
Is that how is pitched to us?
That's what it says in the report, so I'm asking for clarification.
I would like to add to that, too. Yeah. Because I think what I said before about considering other things like the smaller, along with this, the smaller industrial buildings, and I saw some head shakes back there that could be something. It might be a way of selling this council a little better if you had some of that, what's needed in town that are full. If we had more of those in that area, it would help create jobs.
It is at our discretion.
I need to ask the city attorney the question. We had a referral come to us, and the referral is to change from industrial to high-density residential plan development. Can changes be made? Does that have to come from the applicant? Can you give us some guidance?
Does it have to come back if the council wants to change the land use designation?
Okay, the answer is you need the consent of the applicant. The applicant has made a request, and if you're going to consider referring for study for something other than what the applicant has requested, you'll need the applicant's permission. And further, since what I've heard is the request, at least from a number of council members that are in favor of the referral, is to consider other options. I'm not sure if the motion would be to consider the option that's requested as well as additional options as well. That's what I've heard, and if that's what the motion would be, then with the consent of the applicant, of course, they're the ones that are going to be spending the money, to consider options in addition to the one that's been presented, then you should ask the applicant if they would agree to that modification to their application, and you can do that now.
So, but we would need the consent of the applicant first before the motion is...
Yes, because there's no point in making a motion to approve something that the applicant objects to. So is the applicant himself here, or
Hargrave is representing the applicant, and I see his cell phone out. Modern technology.
It's very late. Dennis Hargrave. It's very late where he is, but he has. We would have to get it written up I guess at some point it could be contingent upon this, but he had said yes, he would be supportive of studying other options as well. So.
Okay, good.
And are you authorized then on his behalf to make that representation?
I am not signed. I do not have like we have on track maps, I don't have the power of attorney form, so you would have to make a decision how you want to handle that.
Then my advice would be that we need someone with the authority to make that representation, is that you continue this item to a future council meeting, and at that time have the applicant present with the authority to consent to a study of either the option that's been requested plus additional options or some substitute to the application that's been presented. But I don't think you can approve something on a motion for a request that hasn't been made.
Are there alternative uses on every?
Well, I think in the EIR there would be, but this applicant has made a request that there be a referral for this particular purpose. And as someone has noted, that's going to cost them money to spend to pursue that option. And you've asked me what my opinion is. My opinion is that you could do this if you have their consent to make that referral. They've made a request. You're considering that request plus consideration of other options in the study. Yes, it would be part of the CEQA process, but regardless, I think that we should have the consent of the applicant when you're starting to change or add to the options that are being studied.
If I could provide some additional information that might help the process. Typically what happens with the standard process for a general plan amendment referral is that once you provide direction and allow a referral to proceed, they actually have to file a real general plan amendment application. So you could provide direction tonight, and based on that direction, the applicant would have to consider whether or not they want to truly file the general plan amendment application. And I think that would satisfy the step that Mr. Pierrick has been referring to.
I guess when I asked the mayor to ask you is, if other things were being considered here, other people might have come and talked, and all of that other stuff wasn't in anything in the packet.
I think that's the point. You make a good point, and I think that was part of the reason that I was suggesting that we, in addition to the consent of the applicant, the fact is that it was noticed or it was agendized for consideration of high-density residential. So if the discussion is going to be something other than or in addition to that as a referral, I think you could combine that plus the consent of the applicant, I think, is important. And I understand the point from Mr. Baca, but I still believe that it would be better to put this item over to a future meeting. At that meeting, have authorization from the applicant to have the study to include more than what has been applied for, and the public would be on notice of what the additional pieces would be. So I guess that is what needs to be crystallized a little bit. Is I've heard from a number of council members other options, but if it's going to be agendized for the future, there probably should be some clarification as to what these other options are that you're asking to be considered.
Well, to me, the other options would be to keep it as the industrial.
Well, that wouldn't be a general plan amendment because it already is.
It already is.
I have, Your Honor, I have one that we're going to be dealing with that in a few minutes about mixed-use residential commercial. But this would be one of those that we have needs in industrial. We have the smaller ones. I told you before, we need those smaller industrial areas like Constitution Park, full. We can mix that with residential. So you have a mixed residential industrial. Can we do that?
Council member, I don't think staff can support that option. I think it's mixing too much, and I think you're trying to pack too much into a 14-acre site, quite frankly.
Can't support it.
Mr. Trimley?
Yeah, I can't support that option. What I can support is a referral for, as it's indicated in the staff report, which is an amendment to the general plan land use element designation from the current industrial designation to high-density residential. And all I was thinking about earlier was, the size of the residences within the high-density residential, and I think that's certainly within the scope of that. Would you agree, Mr. Vaca, in terms of the size of the units?
Yes, that's reasonable direction to provide the applicant.
Okay.
So,
I have to go back, though, to the motion that's on the floor. The motion was made to refer this, and I asked for clarification. Does the motion mean to refer it as a change from industrial to high-density residential plan development? The maker of the motion didn't agree that that was the motion he made. The second of the motion said, yes, you're agreeing to the motion as presented, so I'm a little conflicted here on what we're even voting on. So,
Well, there needs to be obviously some clarification on what the motion is. So if the motion is to refer it as requested by the applicant, then that should be clarified by the maker of the motion. The fact is that then you would satisfy the requirement in terms of the public being aware of what was on the agenda and that's what's being approved. Mr. Vaca has provided some helpful information in terms of the consent of the applicant. And with respect to there being a general plan amendment application, that would be their point in time to say go or no go on proceeding with the project. But what needs to be clarified now, Your Honor, is that is the motion to refer for high-density residential, or is it something else?
And going back to what you said, though, with Mr. Vaca's comment that they could change it at the time they actually file it, if the council only approves for high-density residential, then that's all you could do, even if they came in and asked for more. So that's why we're caught here between.
I understand.
See what Mr. Kildee has to say.
Well, the motion was that to change it from high-density industrial to residential, with a caveat, if we can do this, that if that doesn't work and if the applicant is willing to look at another use, and the use would be to keep it industrial, that it already is right now, has got me a little bit confused as well. So that's what I had heard from the applicant, that they would be willing to at least look at perhaps some industrial uses while they go along with this referral and look for, the residential use. Is that specifically what everybody up here is understanding here?
I think he just wants to change it.
Well, I think from what I just heard from Councilmember Kildee, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that your motion is to have it referred for high-density residential, acknowledging that general plan amendment may not be approved and they would keep the industrial. So if that's the case, I think from what I've heard from the council, we'll have to see if you get a second to that, but that sounds like your motion is not conditional. Your motion is to refer it for study for high-density residential.
Mr. Norman, you wanted to say something and I cut you off. I'm sorry.
It seems to me that when we've had referrals before, we've had a lot of discussion about what council members would like to see in some of these referrals, and they're usually variations on the developer's theme, and staff takes that into account. When I was community development director and we had these referrals, I would listen to what each council member said, and they said, I'd like to see this, I'd like to see that, I'd like to see that, and then the community development director and his staff works with the applicant, and they try to meet council's expectations about these different elements of the site that they want to see as it's been referred. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about changing the zoning or having to carve up the site in many different ways. It's just that, many times what you're expressing or the things you've been expressing, like let's say they're smaller units and things like that.
Driveways.
And they're accommodated through this process. There are some things that are not going to be feasible. I mean, everybody wants to take one piece of property and put all their hopes and dreams into the one piece of property. That's just not realistic, and it doesn't shake out that way. So what I would suggest is that council, someone put up a motion to refer this thing for high-density residential, put it up or down for a vote. If it makes it, great. If it doesn't, okay, we get that too, but we've written down everything that you want to see, and we're going to discuss that with the developer. And some of these things are going to shake out. They're going to work. Some of the things they're not going to work.
Can I clarify what you just said, though? So, but that's still not going this other options versus residential. You would still focus on residential.
Yeah, the focus is definitely on residential.
We have a motion.
I'm going to defer to Councilman Kadik because I was ready to offer a substitute motion, but I would defer to Councilman Kadik.
So,
would you like me to offer a substitute motion?
You withdraw your motion.
I'll withdraw my motion.
The second agrees. Now, there's no motion on the floor.
Okay. Now.
All right. I will move that we approve for referral for study an amendment to the general plan land use element designation for the subject property from the current industrial designation to high density residential.
Second.
Could I make with the caveat that staff has taken into consideration all of our comments up there, and they will continue to process that with the applicant as well.
But that only has to do with residential, as Mr. Norman just said. It doesn't have to do with anything with industrial or any other use.
All the comments that were brought up tonight.
Having to do with residential.
Well, what Mr. Norman indicated, and that could be come back with some other little thing that it's mixed.
No, he didn't. I specifically asked him, does that mean only residential? And what did you say, Mr. Norman?
Staff is not going to make a recommendation to have a mixed-use site here with residential and industrial condos on the same site. We're just not going to make that recommendation.
And my intention as the maker of the motion is that it is cleanly related to high density residential only.
Okay.
Okay.
That's the intention of my motion.
Second.
We had a motion, and Mr. Morgan seconded that motion. Let's vote. Oops, I'm sorry, undo mine, please. I slipped. Okay, thank you very much. All right, please vote. And that passes 3 yes with Mrs. Craven and Mrs. McDonald voting no.